Our story begins with James and Emily, a young couple deeply in love and planning their dream wedding. James, a successful architect from a modest but loving family, had been raised primarily by his grandmother, Esther, a strong, dignified black woman who had overcome countless obstacles throughout her 78 years of life. Emily came from a wealthy, predominantly white family with deep social connections in their affluent community. Her parents, Richard and Diane Bennett, were known for their exclusive parties and carefully curated social circle. The engagement announcement initially brought joy to both families, but tensions began to surface when Emily's parents met James's grandmother Esther at their first dinner together. The subtle looks, the condescending tones, and the not-so-subtle questions about where she really came from made their prejudice painfully obvious. James noticed everything: the way Richard barely acknowledged Esther's presence, how Diane spoke to her, as if she couldn't possibly understand the conversations about European vacations and country club memberships. "She's just not our kind of people," Emily's mother had whispered to her daughter later that night. Unaware that James was within earshot, couldn't she just attend the ceremony and skip the reception? "She'll feel so out of place among our friends." Emily, caught between her love for James and her lifetime of deference to her parents' opinions, hadn't immediately defended Esther. Her silence spoke volumes to James, who wondered if he truly knew the woman he was about to marry. As the wedding planning progressed, the tension only grew. Emily's parents made excuses for why Esther couldn't be seated at the family table, suggested she might be more comfortable if she didn't attend certain pre-wedding events, and even questioned whether she should be included in the formal wedding photographs. After all, Richard had said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "She's not really family, is she? Just someone who happened to raise you." For James, who had lost his parents in a car accident when he was just 7, these words cut deeper than any knife. Esther wasn't just his grandmother, she was his rock, his foundation, the woman who had worked 3 jobs to put him through college, who had taught him everything about integrity, perseverance, and unconditional love. As our story unfolds, you'll witness how one shocking revelation at the wedding rehearsal dinner changed everything, proving once again that you should never judge someone before knowing their full story. James Mitchell adjusted his tie nervously as he stood outside the imposing wrought iron gates of the Bennett estate. After dating Emily for 3 years, he'd finally proposed last month, and tonight was the official engagement dinner where their families would meet for the first time. "You look perfect," Emily reassured him, squeezing his hand. "They're going to love you." James smiled back at his fiancée, her blonde hair catching the golden light of sunset. "I'm more worried about how they'll treat Gran," he admitted. "You know how important she is to me." Emily kissed his cheek. "Don't worry so much. My parents are, well, they can be a bit traditional, but they'll see how amazing Esther is." As they walked up the curved driveway, James spotted his grandmother's taxi pulling up. At 78, Esther Mitchell still carried herself with the same dignity and grace that had seen her through the civil rights movement, the loss of her only son, and raising her orphan grandson alone. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple blue dress that James knew she had saved for months to buy. "There's my handsome boy," Esther called out, her warm brown eyes crinkling as she smiled. James hurried to help her from the car, embracing her tightly. "Gran, you look beautiful," he said, feeling a surge of pride and love. "Had to make sure I looked respectable for these fancy folks," she replied with a wink, though James caught the slight nervousness in her voice. The initial introductions in the Bennett's marble-floored entrance hall were stiff but polite. Richard Bennett, a tall man with silvering hair and cold blue eyes, barely touched Esther's hand when they shook. Diane Bennett's smile never reached her eyes as she air-kissed Esther's cheek. "How interesting that you come all this way," Diane said, as if Esther had traveled from another country rather than across town. "The help can take your rap." James felt his jaw tighten at the deliberate pause, the subtle emphasis that made it clear Diane didn't consider Esther's simple shawl worthy of being called a wrap or a stole. "Thank you, dear," Esther replied smoothly, handling over her shawl with a gracious smile that had disarmed many who underestimated her. "Your home is lovely. Reminds me of the governor's mansion I used to visit during my time with the education board." Richard's eyebrows shot up, but he quickly masked the surprise. "You worked as cleaning staff there?" Esther's smile didn't falter. No, Mr. Bennett. I served on the State Education Advisory Board for 12 years, but that was long ago. Throughout dinner, the subtle digs continued. The Bennetts discussed their recent trip to the south of France, their membership at the exclusive Oakmont Country Club, and their daughter's impressive lineage. Emily's great-grandfather founded this town, while directing minimal conversation toward Esther. When Esther mentioned James's late father, her son had been a talented musician, Diane simply nodded and turned the conversation back to wedding plans. We were thinking the Charleston Club will be perfect, Diane announced. Richard's family has been members for generations. Isn't that the club that only integrated in the early 2000s? James asked pointedly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. James, Emily whispered, her cheeks flushing. Richard cleared his throat. Times change. Traditions evolve. But speaking of the guest list, we should keep it manageable. Intimate. Of course, Esther said pleasantly, though James has many friends from all walks of life who love him dearly. The implication hung in the air. Richard and Diane wanted to limit the number of non-white guests at their daughter's wedding. Later that evening, as they walked to their cars, Emily pulled James aside. I know that wasn't perfect, she admitted, but give them time. They're set in their ways. James looked at her seriously. Emily, there's a difference between being set in your ways and being disrespectful to someone I love. Your parents barely acknowledged Gran all night. They're just protective of me, of our family name. And what does that mean for our future? James asked quietly. For our children? Will your parents treat our kids differently if they look more like me or Gran than you? Emily's eyes filled with tears. Of course not. Please, just be patient. As the wedding planning progressed over the next few months, the situation only worsened. Emily's parents took control of every aspect of the ceremony and reception, from the all-white flower arrangements to the guest list that somehow kept losing the names of James's diverse group of friends. The breaking point came during a meeting with the wedding planner, when Diane casually mentioned that perhaps Esther would be more comfortable seated with the couple's friends rather than at the family table. She is family, James said firmly. She raised me. Richard sighed impatiently. Yes, and that's very touching. But surely you understand the family photographs, the seating arrangements, there's a certain aesthetic we're aiming for. James stared at him in disbelief. An aesthetic that doesn't include my black grandmother? Emily placed a hand on his arm. James, please. Mom and Dad are paying for everything. Can't we compromise? In that moment, James wondered if they were making a terrible mistake. As winter melted into spring, wedding preparations intensified, and so did the conflict between the families. Emily was caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to her parents and love for her fiancé. One Saturday afternoon, James arrived at the Bennett home to find Emily and her mother surrounded by sample invitations in the sunroom. The tension in the air was immediate. James! Emily jumped up, kissing him quickly. We were just deciding on the invitations. Actually, Diane corrected, we've already decided. The cream with gold embossing is perfect. James nodded, then noticed something odd about the invitation sample. Wait, where's Gran's name? The invitation says James Mitchell, son of the late Robert and Anna Mitchell, but it doesn't mention Esther at all. Diane and Emily exchanged glances. Well, Diane said carefully, traditionally, invitations only mention the parents, not grandparents. But she raised me after my parents died. She's the only parent I've known for most of my life. James, Emily pleaded, it's just traditional etiquette. The invitation company said. The invitation company would print whatever we asked them to print. James interrupted. This was a choice. That night, their first serious fight as an engaged couple erupted in Emily's apartment. They're trying to erase her from our wedding. James paced the living room. First, they didn't want her at the family table. Then they tried to exclude her from the rehearsal dinner, and now her name isn't even on the invitation. Emily sat on the couch, tears streaming down her face. They're not trying to hurt you. They have this vision of the perfect society wedding. And that vision doesn't include my black grandmother. James finished flatly. Do you hear yourself, Emily? Do you understand what you're defending? That's not fair. My parents aren't racist. They're just traditional. James stopped pacing to look at her directly. Emily, refusing to acknowledge or respect someone because of their race is the definition of racism. It doesn't matter how politely it's done or what excuse is given. Emily buried her face in her hands. What do you want me to do? They're my parents, and they're paying for everything. I want you to stand up for what's right, for the woman who raised a man you claim to love. The fight ended without resolution, both retreating to nurse their wounds. The next morning, Emily called to say she'd spoken to her parents, and they'd agreed to include Esther's name on the invitation. It felt like a hollow victory to James' one small concession after months of disrespect. At the wedding venue walk through the following week, Richard Bennett pulled James aside. "Look, son," he began, his tone falsely congenial. "I understand you're attached to your grandmother. That's admirable. But this wedding isn't just about you and Emily. It's about two families joining, two legacies merging." "I'm aware of that, sir," James replied coldly. "The Bennett name means something in this town. We have a certain position to maintain, certain expectations from our social circle." James felt his temper rising. "And my grandmother doesn't fit those expectations." Richard sighed, as if dealing with a difficult child. "You seem intelligent. Surely you understand the complexities of these situations. Emily's mother and I have been very accommodating, considering the circumstances." "The circumstances?" James repeated incredulously. "Your background, your family situation." Richard glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Many men in my position wouldn't have accepted this match at all. James stared at the man who would soon be his father-in-law, truly seeing him for the first time. "You think you're doing me a favor by allowing me to marry your daughter, despite my background?" "I didn't say that," Richard backpedaled quickly. "But these considerations matter. The wedding photos will be in our family albums forever. They'll be published in the society pages. People will talk." "Yes, they will," James agreed quietly. "They'll talk about how the wealthy, respectable Bennetts treated an elderly woman with disrespect because of the color of her skin." That evening, James visited his grandmother's small but immaculate house in the historically black neighborhood across town. The modest two-bedroom home where he'd grown up was filled with memories, photographs of his parents, his academic achievements, and treasured family moments. Esther was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared her famous sweet potato pie. "I know that look," she said without turning around. "Something's troubling you." James sank into a chair at the kitchen table. "Gran, I don't know if I can go through with this wedding." Esther turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Because of how Emily's folks have been treating me?" "It's not just about you," James admitted. "It's about what their behavior reveals about them. And maybe about Emily, too. She's not standing up to them." Esther sat across from him, taking his hands in hers. "Baby, marriages aren't just between two people. They're between families, cultures, histories. The question isn't whether her parents are perfect. Lord knows none of us are. The question is whether Emily shares their views or has the strength to form her own. She keeps making excuses for them. She's caught between the man she loves and the parents who raised her. That's not an easy place to be." Esther squeezed his hands. "Before you make any decisions, I want to share something with you at the rehearsal dinner. Something I've kept private for many years." James looked up, curious. "What is it?" Esther smiled mysteriously. "Let's just say the Bennetts might be in for quite a surprise." The elegantly decorated private dining room at the Oakmont Country Club glittered with crystal and silver. The rehearsal dinner was Richard and Diane Bennett's chance to impress their social circle with their generosity and taste. Name cards and perfect calligraphy marked each place setting, and James noticed with some satisfaction that his grandmother was, at least, seated at the family table though as far from the Bennetts as possible. When Esther arrived, heads turned. Instead of the simple dresses she usually wore, she was dressed in an elegant sage green suit, a vintage pearl necklace at her throat, and carried herself with such natural dignity that several of Emily's relatives whispered behind their hands, clearly surprised. "Your grandmother cleans up nicely," Richard muttered to James, the backhanded compliment making his blood boil. "Gran has always been elegant, James replied evenly. Some people just weren't paying attention. The dinner progressed through multiple courses, with Richard making a show of selecting the wine and explaining its pedigree to the table. When it came time for toasts, Emily's father stood first, champagne flute in hand. When my little girl first told me about James, he began, I'll admit I had my concerns. A knowing chuckle rippled through the Bennett side of the room. But he's proven himself to be hard-working, intelligent, and most importantly, he makes our Emily happy. James felt Emily squeeze his hand under the table as her father continued. While our families come from different backgrounds, Richard continued with subtle emphasis that made James clench his jaw. We welcome James into the Bennett family tradition, a tradition of excellence, achievement, and social responsibility that dates back generations in this community. After polite applause, James's best man gave a heartfelt toast about their friendship. Then, unexpectedly, Esther stood up, her pearls catching the light. I hope you'll indulge an old woman for a few minutes, she began, her voice clear and strong. I don't often speak at formal gatherings these days, though there was a time when I gave speeches quite regularly. She smiled warmly at the couple. Seeing my James with Emily reminds me so much of another couple I knew long ago. Two people from seemingly different worlds who found love despite the obstacles society placed in their way. James looked at his grandmother curiously. This wasn't a story he'd heard before. You see, Esther continued, before I was Esther Mitchell, I was Esther Freeman, and in 1962, I had the privilege of being the first black woman to attend Westridge College. Emily's mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat. My time there wasn't easy, Esther acknowledged, but I formed a friendship with a young white woman named Margaret in my literature class. Margaret invited me to study sessions, defended me to classmates, and eventually invited me to her family home for dinner, a brave act in those days. The room had fallen completely silent now, all eyes on Esther. Margaret's mother was horrified to find her daughter had brought a black friend home. She wasn't cruel, just frozen in the prejudices of her time. But Margaret's father was different. He sat me down in his study after dinner and talked to me about books, about ideas. He was the first white person of authority who treated me as an intellectual equal. Richard Bennett was staring at Esther now, his face draining of color. That man, Esther continued, reaching into her small clutch purse, was called Edward Bennett. He was a young professor then, not yet the university president he would later become. She pulled out a small, weathered black and white photograph and placed it on the table. This is Margaret Bennett and me at graduation. We remained friends until she passed from cancer in the early 80s. Richard stood up so abruptly his chair nearly tipped over. That's my mother, he stammered, staring at the photograph of the two young women in graduation caps and gowns, arms around each other's shoulders. Yes, Esther confirmed gently. Margaret was my dear friend, and your father, Edward, was the first person who made me believe I belonged in academic spaces. His reference letter helped me get into graduate school. He attended my wedding. He sent flowers when my son James's father was born. The room erupted in murmurs as Richard stared at Esther in shock. But that means, Emily began. It means, Esther finished for her, that your father and my son grew up knowing each other as children before my Robert moved away for college. It means that the friendship between our families goes back decades. She turned to Richard, whose face had gone from pale to flushed. When James first mentioned Emily's full name, I wondered if she might be related to my Margaret. Then he described you, and I knew. You have her eyes, Richard, and when we met, I saw glimpses of Edward's kindness in you, buried perhaps, but there. Richard sank slowly back into his chair. Why didn't you say anything before now? Would it have made a difference? Esther asked quietly. Or would you have seen it as a black woman trying to claim some connection to your prestigious family? I wanted you to accept James and me for who we are, not for who we once knew. Diane Bennett looked shell-shocked. Edward Bennett Richards, father, the former university president and philanthropist, was friends with you? More than friends, Esther corrected gently. He was my mentor, and he would be deeply disappointed to see how you've treated his friend's family. The revelation at the rehearsal dinner left the Bennett family reeling. After the other guests departed, Richard, Diane, James, Emily, and Esther remained at the table, the weight of decades of history between them. "I have letters," Esther said softly. "Birthday cards Edward sent to my son. Photos from university events where we both spoke. He never forgot our friendship, even as he rose in prominence." Richard stared at his hands. "My father never mentioned, he spoke about civil rights, about equality, but I never knew he had close black friends." "Perhaps he sensed you weren't ready to understand," Esther suggested. "Or perhaps he tried in ways you didn't recognize." Diane wiped away tears. "All this time, I don't even know what to say." "You don't need to say anything right now," James told them. "But you do need to decide who you want to be moving forward, the kind of parents, in-laws, and someday grandparents you want to be." Emily, who had been silent throughout much of the exchange, finally spoke. "I'm ashamed," she said simply. "Ashamed that I didn't stand up more firmly for James and Esther. Ashamed that I made excuses for behavior I knew in my heart was wrong." She turned to Esther, eyes brimming with tears. "Can you forgive me?" Esther reached out to take the young woman's hand. "Forgiveness isn't just a word, child. It's a process. But it begins with recognition, and you've taken that step." That night, as James and Emily walked along the moonlit path outside the country club, they had to decide whether their relationship could survive the revelations and tensions of the past months. "I still love you," James said quietly, "but I need to know that we're truly partners, that you'll stand with me when it matters." Emily stopped walking to face him directly. "I will. I promise." Tonight was a wake-up call. Seeing my parents confronted with their own hypocrisy, realizing how I've enabled it. I can't unsee that now. And if our children face prejudice, if they look more like my side of the family, then I'll fight like hell for them, Emily said with unexpected fierceness. "The way I should have fought for you and Esther from the beginning." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. In the bride's dressing room, an unexpected visitor arrived, Richard Bennett, looking uncharacteristically humble. "Emily," he said to his daughter, "I owe you an apology. I've been so concerned with appearances that I nearly ruined what should be the happiest day of your life." He turned to face James's grandmother, who had been helping Emily with her veil. "And Esther, I owe you the deepest apology of all. My father would be ashamed of how I behaved." Esther studied him for a moment. "Edward wasn't perfect, Richard. None of us are. But he was willing to examine his prejudices and grow beyond them. It's never too late to follow his example." Richard nodded solemnly. "I've made some changes to today's arrangements, with Emily's approval. I hope they'll be the first step in making amends." When the ceremony began, guests were surprised to see both Emily's mother and Esther being escorted down the aisle with equal honor. But the biggest surprise came during Richard's father of the bride speech at the reception. "Today isn't just a union of two people," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "It's the reconnection of two families whose histories have been intertwined for longer than any of us realized." He gestured to Esther, seated prominently at the head table. "This remarkable woman was my mother's closest friend and my father's colleague and confidant. Through a twist of fate, or perhaps something more divine, her grandson found and fell in love with my daughter." Richard raised his glass. "To James and Emily, but also to new beginnings, to seeing past our prejudices, and to the amazing ways life brings us full circle when we least expect it." The celebration that followed was unlike anything the Bennett social circle had ever seen, not because of the expensive flowers or premium champagne, but because of the genuine joy and connection that filled the room. James's diverse group of friends mingled with Emily's more homogeneous social set. Esther danced with Richard to a song that had been popular when his mother was alive. Later, as the couple prepared to leave for their honeymoon, Esther pressed something into James's hand, a vintage watch. "This belonged to Edward Bennett," she explained. "He left it to me in his will, asking that I pass it to someone worthy when the time was right. I think he'd approve of it going to his grandson-in-law." James looked at the elegant timepiece, then at his grandmother. "You knew all along what this wedding would mean." Esther smiled. "I hoped. Love has a way of bringing truth to the surface, painful as that process might be." As they drove away from the reception, Emily leaned her head on James's shoulder. "Do you think we'll tell our children this story someday? Every detail. James promised. Because they should know that people can change, that prejudice can be overcome, and that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings come after the most difficult revelations. The weeks and months following James and Emily's wedding brought changes no one could have predicted. Richard and Diane Bennett, once the gatekeepers of exclusive social circles, began using their influence to promote inclusion and diversity in their community. Richard, in particular, seemed determined to reclaim his father's legacy of progressive thinking. "I found boxes of my father's papers in the attic," he told James and Esther over Sunday dinner, now a regular tradition at the Bennett home. Letters he wrote to university boards advocating for more scholarships for minority students. Journal entries about his friendship with you, Esther, and how it changed his worldview. Edward was ahead of his time, Esther acknowledged, but he wasn't perfect. We had our disagreements. "But you remain friends despite them," Richard mused. "That's something I'm still learning." The most profound changes, however, occurred within Emily and James's relationship. The challenges they'd faced before their wedding had forced them to have difficult conversations about race, privilege, and what it meant to truly stand up for each other, conversations that many couples never have until crisis forces the issue. 6 months after their wedding, Emily discovered she was pregnant. As they sat in their new home, looking at the ultrasound image, James felt a surge of both joy and apprehension. "What are you thinking?" Emily asked, noticing his expression. "I'm thinking about our child growing up in a world that still has so many prejudices," James admitted. "About the conversations we'll need to have, the challenges they might face." Emily took his hand. "Then we'll face them together. And our child will have the most amazing great-grandmother as a guide." When their daughter was born, Margaret Esther Mitchell, she had James's dark curly hair and Emily's blue eyes. At the hospital, Esther held her great-granddaughter with tears streaming down her face. "Full circle," she whispered. "Margaret would have loved to see this day." Richard Bennett, the man who once questioned whether Esther belonged in his family photographs, now proudly showed pictures of his granddaughter and her great-grandmother to anyone who would look. The transformation wasn't instant, or perfecto D habits and assumptions occasionally surfaced, but the effort was genuine. On little Margaret's first birthday, Esther presented the family with a gift, a carefully compiled scrapbook containing photographs, letters, and mementos documenting the long history between the Bennetts and her family. "So she'll know where she comes from," Esther explained, "all the parts of her heritage, the struggles and the triumphs." As James flipped through the pages, seeing his parents, his grandmother, alongside images of Emily's family through the years, he felt a sense of completion. The final page held a recent family portrait: James, Emily, baby Margaret, Esther, and the Bennetts, all together. "From separation to unity," Esther said softly. "That's the story of America, at its best. Not pretending differences don't exist, but embracing the full, complex truth of who we are together." That night, after everyone had gone and the baby was asleep, James found Emily looking at the scrapbook again. "What do you see?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Hope," she answered simply, "and a reminder that people can change when love is stronger than prejudice." James smiled, thinking of all they had overcome. "That's the story I want our daughter to know. Not just about wedding drama and shocking revelations, but about the courage it takes to look at your own biases, to admit when you're wrong, and to choose a better way forward." Outside their window, stars twinkled in the night sky. In her room, little Margaret slept peacefully, unaware of the journey that had brought her family together, a journey of confrontation and reconciliation, of painful truths and healing revelations, a journey that proved, in the end, that the greatest shock of all is discovering how love can transform us when we least expect it.